The dust swirled like golden spirits across the parched main street of El Dorado Canyon, Nevada, as Catherine Kane stood motionless on her porch, her blue calico dress fluttering in the evening breeze, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the setting sun painted the sky in hues of amber and crimson. It was the 247th sunset she had watched alone, waiting for a promise that had dissolved into the frontier like morning mist. Spring of 1876 had come to the canyon, but Catherine hardly noticed the wildflowers dotting the hills or the songbirds that had returned from their winter journey. At 26, the softness of her youth had begun to harden into something more resolute. Her honey blonde hair now often tied back severely, her once quick smile becoming a rarity in a town that whispered about poor Miss Kane with equal parts pity and fascination. The general store bell jingled as Catherine descended the porch steps of her modest home that sat just at the edge of town, determined to complete her errands before dusk fully settled. She had learned long ago that a woman alone attracted either trouble or charity, neither of which she welcomed. "Evening, Miss Catherine," Mrs. Powell called from behind the counter, her round face a picture of practiced sympathy. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Thought we might see rain, but it seems to have passed us by." "Yes, seems so," Catherine replied, handing over her short list of necessities. She needed flour, sugar, coffee, and perhaps some fabric for mending. The simple exchanges of commerce were preferable to the inevitable personal inquiries that would follow. "Any word from Mr. Daniels, Mrs. Powell asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper though the store stood empty save for them. Catherine's spine stiffened. "No, Mrs. Powell, no word. Nearly 2 years now, isn't it?" "Why, it's 2 years, 8 months, and 12 days, Catherine said flatly. "And the flour, please, Mrs. Powell busied herself with measuring out the requested items, her lips pressed together in what might have been disapproval or embarrassment. "Such a shame," she murmured, more to herself than to Catherine. The bell above the door jingled again, and both women turned. A tall man ducked through the doorway, removing his hat as he entered. His clothing bore the dust of the trail, and his face was partially obscured by a beard that seemed relatively new, as if he'd simply stopped bothering to shave rather than cultivated the look deliberately. "Afternoon, madam," he said, nodding to Mrs. Powell before his gaze settled on Catherine. His eyes were a startling shade of green standing out against his sun-darkened skin. "Afternoon," Mrs. Powell replied brightly. "Welcome to El Dorado Canyon. You passing through or staying a while?" "Staying, I expect. Name's Adam Fletcher." He extended a hand to the shopkeeper before turning to Catherine with a slight nod. "Miss." Catherine inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement but said nothing. There was something about the way he looked at her, not with the usual pity or curiosity, but with a quiet intensity that made her uncomfortable. She gathered her purchases quickly. "That'll be 85 cents, Miss Catherine," Mrs. Powell said, wrapping the last of the goods in brown paper. Catherine counted out the coins carefully. Money was always tight since the mine had closed and she'd taken to sewing for the townsfolk to supplement what little she earned from selling eggs and vegetables from her garden. "I'll have those curtains ready by Tuesday, Mrs. Powell," she said, gathering her packages. "No rush, dear, no rush at all." The stranger Fletcher stepped aside as Catherine moved toward the door, but not quite far enough. Their shoulders brushed, and she felt his steadying hand at her elbow when she faltered. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice low and roughened by trail dust. "Excuse me," she murmured, slipping past him into the fading daylight. As she walked back toward her home, Catherine felt the weight of eyes on her back and turned to find the stranger watching her from the store's entrance. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect, but didn't smile. Catherine quickened her pace. By the time she reached her gate, The sun had nearly disappeared behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across her yard. Out of habit, she glanced down the long road that led out of town, empty as always except for tumbleweeds and dust. For a moment, she allowed herself the familiar ache of remembering how Thomas had promised to come back with enough gold to make them comfortable for life. Not today either, she whispered to herself, then squared her shoulders and walked up the steps to her empty house. The next morning dawned clear and mild. Catherine was up before sunrise as usual, feeding the chickens and tending to her small garden while the day was still cool. She had just finished watering the struggling tomato plants when she heard the creak of a wagon approaching. Sheriff Willis pulled his horse to a stop at her gate. "Morning, Miss Kane." "Sheriff," she acknowledged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Got a situation in town I thought you should know about," he said, not dismounting. "Seems Thomas Daniels' brother has arrived." Catherine's heart stuttered. "His brother, says his name is Matthew Daniels, came looking for Thomas." The sheriff's weathered face was carefully blank. "Figured you'd want to talk to him, being as you were. Well, promised to each other." "Yes," Catherine said faintly. "Yes, I would. Where is he staying?" "Took a room at the boarding house. Said he'd call on you this afternoon, but I thought you might want some warning." "Thank you, Sheriff." Catherine's mind raced. Thomas had mentioned a brother once or twice older, she recalled, and living somewhere back east. But he'd never come to visit in all the years Thomas had been in El Dorado Canyon. "There's something else," the sheriff added, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "That new fellow, Fletcher. He's asking questions about the Daniels claim. Might be nothing, but thought you ought to know that too." Catherine frowned. "What sort of questions?" "Location mostly. Says he's a prospector himself." Sheriff Willis shrugged. "Could be innocent enough." "Just keep your wits about you." After the sheriff left, Catherine abandoned her gardening and hurried inside to change. If Matthew Daniels was coming to call, she wanted to be properly dressed. It wasn't vanity so much as respect. This was Thomas's brother, after all, and perhaps he brought news. She had just finished pinning her hair when she heard a knock at her door. Smoothing her best day dress faded blue cotton, simple but neat, she took a steadying breath before opening the door. The man on her porch was clearly related to Thomas, the same broad shoulders and square jaw, though Matthew was heavier and his hair more silver than gold. His eyes, however, lacked the warmth that had drawn Catherine to Thomas from the first moment they'd met. "Miss Kane?" he asked formally. "Yes." "Please come in, Mr. Daniels." He stepped into her small parlor, hat in hand, his gaze sweeping the room as if taking inventory. Catherine gestured to her best chair, suddenly conscious of the worn upholstery and the darned doily on its arm. "Sheriff Willis mentioned you were looking for Thomas," she said when they were seated. Matthew nodded. "I've been trying to locate him for some time. Our mother passed last year, and there are matters of inheritance to settle." "I'm sorry for your loss," Catherine said automatically, though her thoughts snagged on his words. "Some time. How long have you been searching?" "Since her passing in February." "Of last year?" His gaze was direct. "I've been to 3 mining camps and 2 towns before this one. No one's seen him in nearly 3 years, according to my information." Catherine's hands tightened in her lap. "He left here 2 years and 8 months ago. Said he'd found a promising claim and needed to register it properly in Carson City." The words felt hollow now, worn smooth from repetition. "He was supposed to return within a fortnight." Matthew's expression didn't change. "And you've had no word since?" "Nothing." The familiar ache bloomed in her chest. "At first I thought perhaps he'd been delayed. Then I worried he might have been injured. Sheriff Willis made inquiries, but—" She trailed off. "But no trace," Matthew finished for her. Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "Miss Kane, I don't wish to be indelicate, but I must ask. What exactly was your relationship with my brother?" The question stung, though she'd been expecting it. "We were engaged to be married. Thomas asked me on Christmas Day, 1873. She lifted her chin slightly. He gave me this house as a promise, said he wanted me to have a home of my own while he worked to build our future. Matthew looked around again, his expression unreadable. The deed is in your name. Yes, it was his gift. I see, he paused. And the mining claim, he never told me exactly where it was, said it was better I didn't know in case word got out. Now the words sounded foolish to her ears. He was going to file the claim and then return with enough capital to expand the house before our wedding. Did he leave anything with you? Papers, maps, letters? Catherine shook her head. No, nothing like that. Matthew leaned forward, his expression softening for the first time. Miss Kane, I don't wish to cause you pain, but I believe we must face facts. My brother has disappeared without a trace for nearly 3 years. Either something happened to him, he held up a hand when she started to speak, or he chose not to return. He wouldn't do that, Catherine said, the words automatic after so many repetitions. Thomas loved me, he promised. Men make promises they don't keep all the time, Miss Kane. Matthew's voice was gentle but firm. Especially men with gold in their eyes. Before Catherine could respond, another knock sounded at her door. She rose, grateful for the interruption, and opened it to find Adam Fletcher standing on her porch. Miss Kane, he said, hat already in hand. I hope I'm not intruding. Mr. Fletcher. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon, and certainly not at her door. I'm actually in the middle of a meeting. From behind her, Matthew spoke. It's all right, Miss Kane. I should be going anyway. He rose and came to the door, extending his hand to Fletcher. Matthew Daniels. Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly as he shook the offered hand. Adam Fletcher. Daniels, you said. Any relation to Thomas Daniels? Matthew's expression sharpened. My brother. You knew him. We crossed paths briefly at a strike about 30 miles north of here. Fletcher glanced at Catherine. That's actually why I came to speak with Miss Kane. I heard in town she might know where to find him. Catherine's heart quickened. When did you see him? Recently? Fletcher's green eyes held a note of sympathy. No, madam. It was nearly 3 years ago now, summer of '73, I believe. Hope, briefly kindled, guttered out. Oh, before he left, then. Matthew was studying Fletcher intently. You're a prospector, too, among other things, Fletcher replied easily. Done some ranching, some scouting, whatever pays, but I've had some luck with finding color where others haven't. Interesting. Matthew turned to Catherine. Miss Kane, I'll call again tomorrow if that's convenient. Perhaps we can continue our discussion then. After Matthew left, Catherine found herself alone with Fletcher, uncertain why he remained. Mr. Fletcher, if you're looking for Thomas, I'm afraid I can't help you. As you may have gathered, he's been gone quite some time. Fletcher nodded. So I've heard. He seemed to hesitate, then said, Miss Kane, may I speak frankly, I suppose? I've been asking around town about Thomas Daniels and his claim. He held her gaze steadily. What I'm hearing doesn't match up with what I know. Catherine frowned. What do you mean? Folks say he left to register a claim he found. But the night I met him, he lost heavily at cards. Told everyone who'd listened that he'd been working a played-out hole for months with nothing to show for it. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. That's not possible. Thomas told me, she stopped, suddenly uncertain. People sometimes say what others want to hear, Miss Kane. His voice was gentle, especially when they're in trouble. Are you suggesting Thomas lied to me? Her voice rose slightly. I'm suggesting that the situation might be more complicated than you know. Fletcher glanced around. May I come in? This isn't a conversation for your doorstep. Against her better judgment, Catherine stepped aside. Once they were seated in her small parlor, Fletcher continued. Your Thomas was in debt that night. Bad debt, to men you don't want to owe. He leaned forward. The kind of men who might come looking eventually. Catherine's mouth went dry. Why are you telling me this? Because Matthew Daniels isn't just here about his brother. Fletcher's green eyes were intense. "He's here about a claim that, from what I can piece together, doesn't exist." "How would you know that?" Catherine demanded. "Because I've spent 2 years tracking down every registered claim within 50 miles of here." Fletcher's voice was matter-of-fact. "And none of them belong to Thomas Daniels." Catherine stood abruptly. "I think you should leave." Fletcher rose as well, but made no move toward the door. "Miss Kane, I'm not here to upset you, but I am concerned. If Thomas was in the kind of trouble I think he was, and if his brother is involved with the same people, my personal affairs are none of your concern, Mr. Fletcher." Catherine's voice shook slightly. "And I won't listen to accusations against a man who isn't here to defend himself." Fletcher studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Fair enough." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of folded paper, setting it on the side table. "If you change your mind about talking, I'm staying at the Silver Dollar, room 6. After he left, Catherine sank back into her chair, trembling. She wanted to dismiss everything Fletcher had said as lies or misunderstandings, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she'd been suppressing for months. Thomas had been evasive about the claim's location. He'd been increasingly anxious in the weeks before he left. And there had been that night when he'd come home late, smelling of whiskey, with a bruise blooming on his jaw that he claimed came from a fall. Catherine shook her head, trying to clear it. No, Thomas had loved her. He had promised to come back. But as she looked around the small house, the house that was supposed to be just the beginning of their life together, she wondered for the first time if the life she'd been waiting to resume had ever truly existed at all. The next morning, Catherine was up before dawn, her sleep having been fitful at best. She dressed carefully for her meeting with Matthew Daniels, choosing a navy skirt and cream blouse that had been her Sunday best until recently. The outfit was modest, but respectable, exactly the impression she wished to convey. As she pinned her hair, Catherine studied her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. The woman who looked back at her seemed older than her 26 years, with faint lines beginning to form at the corners of her eyes and a certain tightness around her mouth. Waiting had aged her, she realized with a start. A knock at her door announced Matthew's arrival precisely at the hour they had agreed upon. Catherine straightened her shoulders and went to answer it. "Good morning, Miss Kane," Matthew said, hat in hand. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you," she lied smoothly. "Please come in." Once they were seated in her small parlor, Matthew came directly to the point. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday and about Mr. Fletcher's assertions." Catherine tensed. "Oh, yes, I find it curious that a stranger would take such an interest in my brother's affairs." Matthew's tone was measured, but she caught an undercurrent of suspicion. "Have you known Mr. Fletcher long?" "I only met him yesterday at the general store." "Yet he came directly to your home shortly thereafter." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "That seems rather forward, doesn't it?" Catherine hadn't considered it that way. "I suppose it does, but he said he was asking around town about Thomas." "Indeed." Matthew steepled his fingers. "Miss Kane, I don't wish to alarm you, but I believe Mr. Fletcher may not be what he seems." "What do you mean?" "My brother was involved in some complicated business dealings before he disappeared. It's possible that Fletcher represents interested parties." Catherine frowned. "Are you suggesting he's looking for Thomas to collect a debt? Something like that?" Matthew shifted in his chair. "Which brings me to the purpose of my visit today. I believe it would be in both our interests if I were to stay here in El Dorado Canyon for a while longer, to determine what exactly Fletcher is after and to continue my search for any clues to Thomas's whereabouts." "Of course," Catherine said automatically. "The boarding house is quite comfortable, I'm told." "Actually," Matthew said, his voice carefully casual, "I thought it might be more convenient and less conspicuous if I were to stay here." Catherine blinked in surprise. Here in this house. It would give us more opportunity to discuss my brother, and I could provide you with some protection should Fletcher prove troublesome. Matthew spread his hands. I understand it might seem improper, but as Thomas's brother, I am practically family, and it would be a temporary arrangement. Alarm bells sounded in Catherine's mind. The suggestion was indeed improper, regardless of any family connection, and something about Matthew's manner made her uneasy. I'm afraid that wouldn't be possible, Mr. Daniels, she said firmly. The house is small, and I value my privacy. Besides, the town already gossips enough about me without adding fuel to the fire. Matthew's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. I see. Perhaps you misunderstand the gravity of the situation, Miss Kane. Thomas may have left certain obligations unmet. Obligations that could potentially fall to you as the owner of property he gifted you. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Catherine felt a chill despite the warm spring day. Are you suggesting that someone might try to claim this house for a debt? I'm suggesting that Thomas's disappearance may have complicated implications. Implications I am trying to resolve. Before Catherine could respond, another knock sounded at her door. With a mixture of annoyance and relief, she excused herself to answer it. Adam Fletcher stood on her porch, looking somewhat more polished than he had the day before, though his clothes still bore the practical marks of a man who worked outdoors. Miss Kane, he said, tipping his hat. I hope I'm not interrupting. Actually, Mr. Fletcher, I'm in the middle of a meeting with Mr. Daniels. Perfect, Fletcher said, surprising her. I was hoping to speak with him as well. Before she could object, he stepped past her into the house, leaving her little choice but to close the door and follow. In her parlor, Matthew Daniels had risen to his feet, his posture tense. Fletcher, he acknowledged coldly. Daniels. Fletcher nodded, equally cool. I thought we might continue our conversation from yesterday. I believe we said all that needed saying. Fletcher smiled thinly. I disagree. He turned to Catherine. Miss Kane, I apologize for the intrusion, but I believe you should hear this. Hear what exactly? Catherine asked, looking between the two men. Mr. Fletcher appears to have formed some rather fanciful theories about my brother, Matthew said dismissively. None of which he can substantiate. Can I? Fletcher reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. This is a wanted poster from Carson City. For one Thomas Daniels, wanted for fraud and theft. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. May I? Matthew held out his hand for the poster. Fletcher passed it over, and Matthew examined it with narrowed eyes. This could be any Thomas Daniels. It's not even a particularly good likeness. The description matches, Fletcher said evenly, including the scar on his left hand from a mining accident. Catherine swayed slightly. Thomas did indeed have such a scar, a jagged line across his palm from a pickaxe mishap the year before they met. She sank into the nearest chair, suddenly needing its support. Even if this is my brother, Matthew said, his voice hard, it doesn't explain your interest in the matter, Fletcher, unless you're a bounty hunter. The question carried clear disdain. Not a bounty hunter, Fletcher replied. More of an interested party. He glanced at Catherine. Miss Kane, there's something else you should know. Your fiancé wasn't just in debt when he disappeared. He was selling fraudulent mining shares to investors back east, shares in a mine that doesn't exist. That's a lie, Catherine said automatically, but her protest lacked conviction. A cold dread was settling in her stomach. I'm afraid it isn't. Fletcher's green eyes held sympathy but no uncertainty. I've spent the last year tracking down the victims of his scheme. 15 people who invested their life savings in the El Dorado Star mine, a mine that exists only on paper. Matthew crumpled the wanted poster in his fist. This is outrageous. You come here making accusations without a shred of real evidence. I have sworn statements from 12 of the investors. Fletcher cut in. and documentation of the transfers. Your brother collected over $20,000 before he disappeared. He turned to Catherine. Did he ever mention the El Dorado Star to you, Miss Kane? She shook her head numbly. $20,000. It was an unimaginable sum. Of course he didn't, Fletcher continued gently. Because there is no El Dorado Star mine. Just a very clever confidence man and a lot of people who wanted to believe in easy riches. Matthew threw the crumpled poster to the floor. I've heard enough of this slander. Miss Kane, I suggest we continue our discussion later, when we're not subjected to these wild accusations. He moved toward the door. I wouldn't leave town just yet if I were you, Daniels, Fletcher called after him. The sheriff might be interested in what you know about your brother's activities. Matthew paused, his back stiffening, but didn't turn around. A moment later, the door slammed behind him. An uncomfortable silence filled the small parlor. Catherine stared at the crumpled poster on the floor, unable to bring herself to pick it up and read the charges against the man she'd loved. I'm sorry, Fletcher said finally. I didn't want you to find out like this. Then why tell me at all? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. If what you say is true, Thomas is gone. What good does it do to destroy the memory of him too? Fletcher sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Because Matthew Daniels isn't here to find his brother, Miss Kane. He's here to find the money. Catherine looked up sharply. What? Thomas Daniels didn't just disappear. He staged his own death after the scheme started to unravel, but not before hiding the proceeds somewhere in or near El Dorado Canyon. Fletcher's voice was low and urgent, and Matthew was his partner. The room seemed to tilt around Catherine. How do you know all this? Because I was one of the investors, Fletcher admitted. I put $500, my entire savings, into the El Dorado Star, money I'd earned through years of honest work. His jaw tightened briefly. But I was luckier than most. I could go back to ranching, start over. Others lost everything. So you're here for revenge, Catherine said flatly. Justice, Fletcher corrected. And to recover what was stolen, if possible. He hesitated. I didn't expect to find you, though. A woman still waiting faithfully for a man who never intended to return. The words struck Catherine like a physical blow. She rose abruptly, needing to move to breathe. I think you should go, Mr. Fletcher. He stood as well but made no move toward the door. Miss Kane, Catherine, I understand this is difficult to hear. But you need to be careful around Matthew Daniels. If he believes you know where the money is hidden. I don't know anything about any money, Catherine's voice rose. I don't know if anything you've told me is true. For all I know, you could be the confidence man, spinning tales to the what. What exactly do you want from me? Your help, Fletcher said simply. Thomas may have told you something, shown you something that seemed insignificant at the time but could lead to where he hid the money. A location, a landmark, anything unusual in the weeks before he left. Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the warm spring day. Even if I wanted to help you, and I'm not saying I do, I can't think of anything like that. Thomas was private about his prospecting, said it was bad luck to talk too much about a strike before it was secure. And you never questioned that. Never wondered why he wouldn't share the details with the woman he supposedly planned to marry. The question hit too close to doubts Catherine had buried deep. Get out, she said, her voice shaking. Just get out, please. Fletcher studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. He retrieved his hat from where he'd set it, pausing at the door. I'll go. But remember what I said about Matthew Daniels. He's dangerous, Catherine, and he's not your friend. After he left, Catherine sank back into her chair, feeling as if the foundations of her world had crumbled beneath her. Could it be true? Had the last 2 years and 8 months been not just a tragedy but a farce of vigil kept for a man who had deceived her from the start? She thought of Thomas's face, so earnest when he'd promised to return. The way he'd kissed her goodbye that last morning, tender and lingering. The house he'd bought for her not much, but more than she'd ever owned before. But then other memories surfaced. Thomas's vague answers when she'd asked about his claims. The times he'd returned from Carson City with new clothes and gifts, despite claiming the mine wasn't producing yet. The late-night visitors she'd glimpsed occasionally, men Thomas never introduced her to. Catherine pressed her hands to her face, fighting back tears. She didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. The man she'd been waiting for all this time might never have existed at all. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her small bedroom, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the house, her mind racing with questions and doubts. Outside, a spring storm had blown in, bringing gusting wind and sporadic rain that rattled against her windows. Was Thomas truly the man Fletcher had described? A confidence man who had stolen from innocent people and then vanished, leaving her waiting for a return that was never planned? Or was Fletcher the liar, spinning tales for his own mysterious purposes? And what of Matthew Daniels? If Fletcher was to be believed, Matthew wasn't just Thomas's brother but his criminal partner. A man who might be dangerous. Catherine turned restlessly in her bed, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. She'd given nearly 3 years of her life to waiting for Thomas. Had turned down 2 marriage proposals from respectable men in town. Had let youth and opportunity slip away while she stood faithful to a promise. All for a lie. A particularly strong gust of wind shook the house, and somewhere a shutter banged. Catherine sat up, frowning. All her shutters should have been secured. She'd checked them herself before retiring, a habit from living alone. The sound came again, a sharp crack, then a rhythmic tapping. Catherine lit her bedside lamp and pulled on her robe. Barefoot, she padded through the darkened house to the front room, where the noise seemed to be coming from. The loose shutter was on the window beside her front door. Catherine set her lamp on the side table and peered out through the glass, trying to see if the securing latch had come undone. But instead of a swinging shutter, she saw a figure on her porch, a man, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of her lamplight. Catherine gasped and stumbled back from the window. Before she could retreat further, a soft knock sounded at her door. "Who's there?" She called, her voice remarkably steady despite her racing heart. "It's Fletcher," came the muffled reply. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Catherine hesitated. It was highly improper for a man to call on a woman living alone at this hour, but then again, nothing about her current situation could be called proper. "One moment," she said, quickly buttoning her robe to her throat and smoothing her loose hair. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain latched. "Mr. Fletcher, it's the middle of the night. I know, and I apologize." He was soaked from the rain, his hat dripping water onto her porch boards. "But something's happened. May I come in?" Against her better judgment, Catherine unlatched the chain and stepped back. Fletcher entered quickly, removing his wet hat and coat. "What's happened?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself against both the chill from the open door and her own nerves. "Matthew Daniels broke into my room at the boarding house tonight," Fletcher said without preamble, "held a gun on me and demanded to know what I'd done with his share." "His share of what?" "The money from the El Dorado Star scheme." Fletcher ran a hand through his damp hair. "He doesn't believe me when I say I don't have it, and now he's convinced you and I are working together to keep it from him." Catherine felt her knees weaken. She sank into the nearest chair. "This is insane. I don't know anything about any money." "I believe you," Fletcher said, his green eyes intent on her face. "But Matthew doesn't, and he's desperate. He talked about people back east who are getting impatient, people who funded the initial setup of the scheme and expect their cut." "What did you tell him?" "That I came here looking for Thomas just like he did, and that neither of us has found anything." Fletcher grimaced. He didn't take it well, so he just let you go, Catherine asked skeptically. Not exactly. Fletcher pushed up his sleeve to reveal a hastily bandaged forearm. He decided to encourage me to be more forthcoming. Catherine gasped. He cut you, just a warning. For now. Fletcher pulled his sleeve back down, but he made it clear that his patience is running out. And he believes that you're the key, that Thomas must have told you something, left you some clue. I've told you he didn't. Catherine's voice rose in frustration. Thomas never shared details about his mining activities with me, he said. She trailed off, a memory suddenly surfacing. What? Fletcher prompted. Catherine, what did you remember? It's probably nothing, she said slowly. Just something Thomas said the morning he left. He gave me a small bag of gold flakes, said they were the first fruits of our future. Catherine frowned, thinking. He told me to keep them somewhere safe, somewhere only I would know to look. Fletcher leaned forward intently. And did you? Where did you hide them? In my mother's old Bible, Catherine admitted. It was the safest place I could think of. No one but me ever opens it. Show me, Fletcher said, his voice suddenly urgent. Catherine hesitated, then rose and went to the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. The Bible was easily identifiable, larger than her other books, its leather cover worn smooth from generations of hands. She pulled it down and brought it back to where Fletcher waited. Carefully, she opened the Bible to Psalms, where a small cloth pouch nestled in a hollow cut into the pages. Catherine had felt guilty about defacing the sacred text, but it had seemed the most secure hiding place in her modest home. She removed the pouch and handed it to Fletcher. He untied the drawstring and tipped a small quantity of gold flakes onto his palm. This is it, he asked, sounding disappointed. There can't be more than $10 worth here. I told you it wasn't much, Catherine said defensively. Just a token, he said. Fletcher was examining the gold flakes closely, rubbing them between his fingers. Suddenly he stilled, his expression changing. These aren't from any claim around here. How can you tell? The color, the texture. Fletcher looked up, his eyes bright with excitement. I've worked enough mines to recognize regional differences. This gold is from California, not Nevada. Catherine shook her head, confused. That doesn't make sense. Thomas never mentioned California. No, he wouldn't have. Fletcher carefully poured the flakes back into the pouch. Catherine, I think this was a message, a clue to where he hid the real money. In California. The idea seemed absurd. But why would he send me on a wild goose chase across the country? Not across the country, Fletcher said thoughtfully. Just to the right place. He looked around the small parlor. Did Thomas have any maps, books about California, anything that might indicate a specific location? Catherine thought for a moment. There's a trunk of his things in the spare room. I never had the heart to go through it all after he left, just in case. She didn't finish the thought. May I see it? She led him to the small second bedroom that she used mainly for storage. Thomas's trunk sat at the foot of the narrow bed, a layer of dust testifying to how long it had remained unopened. Catherine knelt before it, her hands hesitating on the latch. Opening this trunk meant admitting something she'd been unwilling to face. That Thomas wasn't coming back, that the life she'd been waiting to resume was over before it had truly begun. Fletcher seemed to understand her reluctance. He knelt beside her, his presence somehow reassuring. You don't have to do this, he said softly. Yes, I do. Catherine took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The trunk contained the mundane possessions of a man's life. Clothing, a spare pair of boots, a few books. A shaving kit with a straight razor that brought back memories of watching Thomas at his morning ablutions. His face half covered in soap as he smiled at her in the mirror. Catherine swallowed hard and continued her search. Near the bottom of the trunk, she found a leather portfolio containing various papers, land records for the house, receipts, letters. Here, she said, handing it to Fletcher. This seems most likely to contain something useful. Fletcher brought the portfolio back to the parlor, where the lamplight was stronger. Together, they spread the papers on the small table and began to examine them. Most seemed unexceptional business correspondence, records of minor transactions, a few personal letters from acquaintances in other towns. "Wait," Fletcher said suddenly, pulling one document from the stack. "Look at this." It was a deed to a parcel of land not in El Dorado Canyon, but in a place called Coloma, California. "Coloma," Catherine read, frowning. "I've never heard of it." "I have," Fletcher said, excitement threading through his voice. "It's where gold was first discovered in California back in '48. Started the whole rush." He examined the deed closely. According to this, Thomas purchased a small claim there 2 years ago, just months before he disappeared. But why would he buy land in California when he was mining here in Nevada? "Because he wasn't really mining here," Fletcher said. "Remember, the El Dorado Star was a fiction. But this," he tapped the deed, "this is real, and it would be the perfect place to hide the money from his investors, a quiet investment in the place where the gold rush began." Catherine sat back, trying to absorb this new information. "So you think Thomas is in California, at this Coloma place, or he was at some point?" Fletcher's expression turned grim. "The question is, does Matthew know about this?" As if in answer to his question, a sharp knock sounded at the front door, startling them both. Catherine and Fletcher exchanged alarmed glances. "Were you followed?" Catherine whispered. Fletcher shook his head. "I don't think so," but the knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice that made Catherine's blood run cold. "Miss Kane," Matthew Daniels called through the door. "I know you're awake, and I know Fletcher is in there with you. Open the door or I'll be forced to break it down." Fletcher quickly gathered the papers, stuffing them back into the portfolio. "Is there a back way out?" he whispered. Catherine nodded. "Through the kitchen." "Take these." Fletcher pressed the portfolio and the pouch of gold into her hands. "Go to the sheriff. Tell him everything. I'll deal with Daniels." "But he's armed," Catherine protested. "He hurt you once already." "I can handle myself," Fletcher assured her, guiding her toward the kitchen. "Just go. Quickly and quietly." Catherine hesitated, torn between fear and reluctance to leave Fletcher alone to face Matthew. "Be careful," she whispered, then slipped through the darkened kitchen toward the back door. Behind her, she heard the front door open, followed by Matthew's voice, tight with anger. "Where is she, Fletcher?" "Gone," Fletcher replied calmly. "And so is the evidence of what you and Thomas did." Catherine didn't wait to hear more. She unbolted the back door and stepped out into the rainy night, the precious documents clutched to her chest. The storm had intensified, and the wind nearly took her breath away as she hurried across her small yard toward the alley that would lead to the main street. The sheriff's office was at the far end of town, a good 10-minute walk under normal circumstances. But in the dark, with rain lashing her face and the wind tugging at her robe, Catherine knew it would take longer. She pulled the sodden fabric tighter around her body and pressed on, her bare feet splashing through puddles that had already formed on the dirt road. She had gone perhaps 100 yards when she heard a shout behind her, barely audible over the storm. Glancing back, Catherine saw a figure emerge from her house too bulky to be Fletcher. Matthew had discovered her absence and was in pursuit. Fear gave her new energy. Catherine broke into a run, no longer caring about the mud that splattered her nightgown or the sharp stones that bruised her feet. All that mattered was reaching the sheriff before Matthew caught up with her. The main street was deserted, the usual evening activities curtailed by the storm. Most windows were dark, their occupants long since retired for the night. But ahead, Catherine could see the faint glow of a lamp in the sheriff's office, a beacon of hope in the darkness. She was within sight of her destination when her foot caught on a loose board in the wooden sidewalk. Catherine stumbled, the portfolio and gold pouch flying from her grasp as she fell heavily to her knees. The contents of the portfolio scattered, papers instantly soaked by the relentless rain. No, Catherine scrambled to gather them, her hands slipping on the wet documents. Behind her, Matthew's footsteps grew closer. Just as she reached for the deed to the California property, a boot came down on it, pinning it to the boardwalk. Catherine looked up into Matthew Daniels' face, contorted with rage and wet from the rain. "Did you really think you could outrun me?" He snarled, reaching down to grab her arm. Catherine tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me." "Not until you tell me what you and Fletcher have done with my money," Matthew hissed, yanking her to her feet. "It's not your money," Catherine retorted, finding courage in her anger. "It was stolen from innocent people, people like Mr. Fletcher." Matthew's laugh was harsh. "Fletcher, an innocent," he shook his head. "You are more naive than I thought, Miss Kane. Adam Fletcher is no victim. He's a U.S. Marshal who's been hunting Thomas for over a year." Catherine felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. "A marshal? Oh, he didn't tell you that part?" Matthew's smile was cruel. "Interesting. I wonder what else he hasn't told you." Before Catherine could respond, a new voice cut through the storm. "Let her go, Daniels." Fletcher stood a few yards away, his stance wide and steady despite the wind and rain. In his hand was a gun, pointed directly at Matthew. "Marshal Fletcher," Matthew acknowledged, his grip on Catherine's arm not loosening. "I was just telling Miss Kane about your true profession." "I was getting to that," Fletcher said evenly. "Now let her go and step away from those papers." Instead, Matthew pulled Catherine closer, using her as a shield. "I don't think so. Not until we come to an understanding." "The only understanding is that you're under arrest," Fletcher replied, "for assault, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud." "You have no proof of any conspiracy," Matthew said, "and your word against mine won't stand up in court." "Maybe not, but those papers might." Fletcher nodded toward the scattered documents at their feet, particularly that deed to Coloma. "Interesting choice of location for your brother to invest in, don't you think? Right where the California gold rush began." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, surprise, quickly masked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Fletcher continued steadily. "I think Thomas told you exactly where he was going and what he planned to do with the money. And I think you came here to collect your share." Catherine felt Matthew's grip tighten painfully on her arm. She winced but remained silent, watching Fletcher's face. Despite the rain and the tension of the moment, he appeared calm, focused. "You're bluffing," Matthew said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Fletcher took a step closer. "Thomas purchased that land in Coloma 6 months before he disappeared from El Dorado Canyon. Paid cash, according to the deed. Now why would a man supposedly prospecting in Nevada buy land in California unless he was planning to go there?" "Speculation," Matthew said dismissively. "Lots of miners invest in other territories." "True. But most don't disappear right after collecting $20,000 from fraudulent investment schemes." Fletcher was only a few paces away now. "Let Miss Kane go, Daniels. It's over." For a moment, Catherine thought Matthew would comply. His grip on her arm loosened slightly, and she felt him shift his weight as if preparing to release her. Then, in one swift motion, Matthew reached into his coat with his free hand and pulled out a revolver of his own, pressing it to Catherine's temple. "Back off, Marshal," he growled. "Or Miss Kane won't live to see the morning." Fletcher froze, his expression hardening. "You don't want to do this, Daniels. Threatening a woman's life will only make things worse for you." "Things can't get much worse," Matthew replied bitterly. "Now drop your weapon, slowly." Fletcher hesitated, his green eyes meeting Catherine's for a brief moment. She saw a question there and somehow understood what he was asking. Almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "All right," Fletcher said, bending slowly to place his gun on the wet boardwalk. "Just stay calm." As he straightened, Catherine made her move. Using all her strength, she drove her elbow backward into Matthew's stomach. The unexpected blow caused him to double over, his grip on her loosening. Catherine tore free and lunged to the side just as Fletcher sprang forward. The two men collided, Matthew's gun discharging with a crack that was almost lost in a roll of thunder. Catherine screamed, momentarily blinded by the muzzle flash. When her vision cleared, she saw the men grappling on the rain-slicked boardwalk, fighting for control of Matthew's revolver. "Catherine, run!" Fletcher shouted, his face contorted with effort as he struggled to keep the weapon pointed away from both of them. Instead of fleeing, Catherine scrambled to gather the scattered papers, stuffing them back into the portfolio along with the pouch of gold. Then she looked around desperately for something to help Fletcher. A few feet away lay the gun Fletcher had dropped. Catherine lunged for it, her hands shaking as she picked it up. The weight of it surprised her. She had never held a firearm before. "Fletcher," she called, unsure what to do next. Both men looked up at her voice. Matthew's eyes widened at the sight of the gun in her hands, and in that moment of distraction, Fletcher landed a solid blow to his jaw. Matthew's head snapped back, and Fletcher wrenched the revolver from his grasp. "Don't move," Fletcher ordered, pressing the barrel against Matthew's chest. Just then, the sheriff's office door burst open, light spilling onto the rain-soaked scene. Sheriff Willis stood silhouetted in the doorway, his own gun drawn. "What in tarnation is going on out here?" he demanded, taking in the tableau before him. Catherine in her nightclothes holding a gun, Fletcher pinning Matthew to the ground, and papers scattered everywhere despite Catherine's efforts to gather them. "Sheriff," Fletcher called, not taking his eyes off Matthew. "Marshal Adam Fletcher, U.S. Marshal's Service. This man is Matthew Daniels, wanted in connection with a fraud scheme that stole thousands from investors across 3 territories." Sheriff Willis squinted through the rain. "Got any proof of these claims, Marshal, or of your own identity for that matter?" "In my left breast pocket," Fletcher replied. "My credentials. And Miss Kane has documentation that will help substantiate the charges." The sheriff approached cautiously, retrieving Fletcher's badge and papers while keeping his own weapon trained on both men. After examining the credentials, he nodded. "Seems in order. Miss Kane, why don't you come inside where it's dry, and perhaps you'd like to put that gun down before someone gets hurt." Catherine realized she was still clutching Fletcher's revolver. She lowered it carefully, her hands trembling from cold and reaction. "Sheriff, everything Marshal Fletcher has said is true. Matthew Daniels threatened me, and he was going to force me to go with him to California, where his brother has hidden the money from their scheme." Sheriff Willis gestured for her to enter the office. "Let's get you inside, miss. You look half drowned." To Fletcher, he added, "Bring him in, Marshal. I've got a cell where he can spend the night while we sort this out." As Catherine stepped into the warm, dry office, clutching the portfolio of evidence to her chest, she felt a curious lightness despite her sodden clothes and chattering teeth. For the first time in nearly 3 years, she was moving forward instead of waiting. The truth about Thomas was painful, but at least it was the truth. And that, she realized, was something she had been needing for a very long time. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous night's storm had never happened. Catherine sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold before her as she stared out the window at her small garden, still glistening with raindrops. She had barely slept after the events of the night. Sheriff Willis had taken her statement, then insisted on escorting her home and checking the house to ensure that no one else was lurking about. Marshal Fletcher, she corrected herself, had remained behind to secure Matthew Daniels in the jail and send telegrams to his superiors about the arrest. Now, In the harsh light of day, Catherine was trying to reconcile everything she had learned. Thomas, the man she had loved and waited for so faithfully, had been a criminal. A confidence man who had stolen from people like Fletcher, then disappeared with the money. He had never intended to return to her. The realization hurt more than she had expected. Not just the betrayal, but the wasted years' time she could never get back, spent waiting on her porch for a man who had never planned to come back to her. A knock at her door interrupted her melancholy thoughts. Catherine rose wearily, running a hand over her hair, which she had hastily pinned up after her bath that morning. Her best day dress, the only one not mud splattered from her midnight flight, rustled as she moved to answer the door. Marshal Fletcher stood on her porch, looking as tired as she felt but considerably more composed than he had in the midst of the storm. His green eyes studied her face with concern. "Miss Kane," he said, removing his hat, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Catherine replied, stepping back to allow him entry. "I was just thinking." Fletcher entered, his gaze taking in the untouched coffee and Catherine's drawn expression. "You haven't slept," he observed. "Neither have you, from the looks of it." Catherine gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table, then poured him a cup of coffee from the pot keeping warm on her stove. "I imagine you've had a busy night." "Indeed." Fletcher accepted the coffee gratefully. "Matthew Daniels is being transferred to Carson City today to face charges. And I've received responses to my telegrams confirming that Thomas Daniels was seen in Coloma, California, as recently as 3 months ago." Catherine sat across from him, absorbing this information. "So he's alive?" "Yes." Fletcher's voice was gentle. "I'm sorry, Catherine." She shook her head. "Don't be. At least now I know." She took a sip of her cold coffee, grimacing at the taste. "What will happen to him when you find him?" "He'll stand trial for fraud, most likely. With the evidence we have now, including Matthew's involvement, a conviction is almost certain." Fletcher paused. "The penalties for such crimes vary, but given the amount stolen and the number of victims, he could face several years in prison." Catherine nodded, finding that the news caused her less pain than she would have expected even a day ago. "And the money? Will the people who were cheated get it back?" "That's my hope," Fletcher said. "If we can locate the full amount, it will be returned to the victims proportionally." He hesitated. "I'm leaving for California today to continue the search." "Today?" Catherine looked up in surprise. "So soon? The trail is fresh now." "And with Matthew in custody, Thomas may try to move the money if word reaches him." Fletcher's expression was apologetic. "I would have given you more notice, but events have moved quickly." Catherine felt a strange hollowness at the news of his imminent departure. In the short time since Fletcher had arrived in El Dorado Canyon, her entire understanding of the past 3 years had been upended. And somehow, in the midst of that upheaval, she had come to rely on his steady presence. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "You have your duty." Fletcher set down his coffee cup, studying her face. "Catherine, there's something I've been meaning to ask you, something that's troubled me since I first heard your story." "What's that? Why did you wait so long?" His voice was soft, without judgment. "Most women would have accepted that Thomas wasn't coming back after a few months, a year at most. But you kept waiting for nearly 3 years. Why?" The question caught her off guard, forcing her to confront something she had avoided examining too closely. "I suppose," she said slowly, "because waiting gave me purpose. As long as I was waiting for Thomas, I had a reason for being alone, for not moving forward." She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "It was easier than admitting I had been abandoned." "You weren't just abandoned," Fletcher said, leaning forward intently. "You were deceived by a man who made lying his profession. Don't blame yourself for believing him when that's exactly what he wanted." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them away. "Thank you for saying that," she whispered. Fletcher reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "What will you do now?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, fraught with possibilities. Catherine looked around her small kitchen, the home Thomas had given her, now revealed as perhaps the only honest gift in their relationship. "I don't know," she admitted. "Stay here, I suppose. This is my home now, regardless of how I came to have it. Continue with my sewing and gardening." The future she described sounded hollow even to her own ears. Fletcher seemed to hear it too. He hesitated, then said, "You could come with me." Catherine stared at him. "To California?" "Yes." Fletcher's green eyes held hers steadily. "To help identify Thomas if we find him. And to see a part of the country you've never seen before." He squeezed her hand gently. "You've spent too long waiting on that porch, Catherine. Maybe it's time to step off it and see what else the world has to offer." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Catherine wanted to admit. But caution held her back. "Marshall Fletcher, Adam," he corrected. "Please." "Adam," she conceded. "I barely know you, and after what happened with Thomas, I'm not inclined to trust my judgment where men are concerned." "Fair enough," he acknowledged. "But consider this. You've already seen me at my worst, muddy, bleeding, fighting for my life in a rainstorm. And I've seen you brave and resourceful under tremendous pressure." His smile was wry. "That's more honest knowledge of each other than most people gain in months of proper courtship." Catherine couldn't help but return his smile. "That's true, but still to travel together unchaperoned." "As a federal marshal, I can hire you as a material witness," Adam said. "All very proper and official, separate accommodations at every stop, of course." His expression grew more serious. "I'm not Thomas, Catherine. I'm not offering you pretty lies or empty promises. Just a chance to see something beyond El Dorado Canyon while helping to bring closure to others who were deceived." Catherine looked down at their joined hands, turning the proposition over in her mind. 3 days ago, she would never have contemplated such an impulsive action. But 3 days ago, she had still been Catherine Kane, the woman who waited faithfully for a man who would never return. Now she was just Catherine, a woman with no obligations to the past and an uncertain future before her. "When would we leave?" she asked, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Adam's face brightened. "The afternoon stage, if you can be ready by then." "That's only a few hours from now." "I know it's not much time," he admitted. "But the sooner we get to Coloma, the better our chances of finding Thomas and the money." Catherine's mind raced, considering what she would need to pack, what arrangements would need to be made for her house and garden during her absence. "I'd have to speak with Mrs. Powell about watching the house, and Sheriff Willis should know where I'm going. And is that a yes?" Adam interrupted, hope clear in his voice. Catherine looked up, meeting his green eyes. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of excitement about the future, a sense of possibility that had nothing to do with waiting and everything to do with moving forward. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'll go with you." Adam's smile was like the sunrise after the storm, warm and full of promise. "I'll be here at 2 o'clock with the wagon to take us to the stage depot." As he rose to leave, Catherine felt a momentary panic. "Adam, what if we don't find him? Or the money?" He paused at the door, his expression serious. "Then at least we'll have tried. And you'll know for certain that you've done everything possible to find the truth." He hesitated, then added softly, "And regardless of what we find in Coloma, Catherine, I promise you won't be making the journey home alone. I'll be the one who comes back with you." After he left, Catherine sat for a long moment at her kitchen table, the gravity of her decision settling over her. Then, with a decisive nod, she rose and began preparing for a journey she had never expected to take. 3 hours later, Catherine stood on her porch for what might be the last time in many weeks, perhaps months. Her trunk was packed with practical clothes and a few cherished possessions. The house was secure, with arrangements made for Mrs. Powell to check on it regularly. Sheriff Willis had been informed of her departure and its purpose, his gruff approval tempered with warnings to be careful. As Catherine waited for Adam to arrive with the wagon, she looked out over the familiar view of El Dorado Canyon, the dusty Main Street, the distant mountains, the small gardens and homes of her neighbors. For nearly 3 years, this porch had been her lookout point, the place where she had stood every evening scanning the horizon for a returning figure that never appeared. Now she was leaving it behind, stepping into an unknown future with a man she barely knew but somehow trusted. The sound of wagon wheels drew her attention. Adam Fletcher guided a rented buckboard to her gate, his expression brightening when he saw her waiting. He had changed into clean clothes for the journey, and the badge of his office was pinned to his vest, catching the afternoon sunlight. "Ready," he called, jumping down from the wagon seat. Catherine took one last look at her porch, the weathered boards where she had stood so many lonely vigils. Then she picked up her small valise and descended the steps. "Yes," she said, meeting Adam's gaze with a smile that felt new and unfamiliar on her face. "I'm ready." As Adam loaded her trunk into the wagon and helped her onto the seat beside him, Catherine felt a curious lightness in her heart. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for someone to return to her. She was going forward to meet her future, whatever it might hold. The wagon pulled away from the small house, dust rising behind it in the afternoon sun. Catherine didn't look back. The journey to Coloma, California, was longer and more arduous than Catherine had anticipated. The stagecoach ride to Carson City was merely the first leg of a trip that eventually included a jarring, dusty journey over the Sierra Nevada mountains and into the rolling foothills of California's gold country. Throughout the journey, Adam proved to be a considerate traveling companion, respectful of her privacy at each overnight stop, solicitous of her comfort during the difficult stretches of road, and willing to share stories of his life that gradually filled in the picture of who he was. She learned that he had grown up on a small ranch in Colorado, the youngest of 4 brothers, that he had worked as a cowhand, a prospector, and briefly as a town deputy before joining the U.S. Marshals, that his investment in Thomas's fraudulent scheme had represented his hopes of buying a small ranch of his own someday. "I should have known better," he told her as they sat on the porch of a way station, watching the sunset paint the Sierra Peaks gold and rose. "Men who promise easy riches are usually selling nothing but air." "We believe what we want to believe," Catherine replied, thinking of her own willing blindness to Thomas's inconsistencies. "Hope is a powerful thing." Adam studied her profile in the fading light. "It is, but so is resilience." His voice softened. "You're stronger than you know, Catherine." Those quiet moments of connection punctuated what was otherwise a purposeful journey. Adam never lost sight of their mission, and each evening he would review their progress and the plan for confronting Thomas when they found him. "The telegraph from my colleague in Sacramento confirms that Thomas Daniels purchased supplies in Coloma 2 months ago," he told Catherine on the final night before they reached their destination. "He's going by the name Thomas Davis now, but the description matches. He's still there." Catherine absorbed this information with a curious detachment. The anger and hurt she had initially felt upon learning of Thomas's deception had faded during the journey, replaced by a calm determination to see this matter through to its conclusion. "What will happen when we find him?" she asked. "I'll arrest him," Adam said simply. "He'll be returned to Nevada to stand trial alongside his brother. And if he resists—" Adam's expression grew serious. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." He reached across the small table that separated them, taking her hand. "Catherine, when we get to Coloma, I want you to let me handle the arrest. Your role is to identify him, nothing more." "I understand," she said, though a part of her hoped for a chance to confront Thomas herself, to look him in the eye and ask why he had left her waiting for a return he never intended to make. They arrived in Coloma the following afternoon, the stagecoach depositing them in front of a modest hotel on the town's main street. Coloma was larger than El Dorado Canyon, but still bore the unmistakable character of a mining town, a mixture of substantial buildings and hastily erected structures, with men in varying states of trail dust moving purposefully along the boardwalks. "We'll get rooms first," Adam decided, helping Catherine down from the coach. "Then make some discreet inquiries about our friend Mr. Davis." The hotel was clean and relatively comfortable, a step above the way stations they had stayed in during their journey. After washing away the dust of travel and changing into a fresh dress, Catherine met Adam in the small dining room for a late lunch. "I've already learned that Thomas has been a regular at the Nugget Saloon," Adam told her quietly over their meal. "Seems he set himself up as something of a mining consultant, offering advice to newcomers for a fee." "Still preying on people's dreams of striking it rich," Catherine observed bitterly. Adam nodded. "From what the hotel clerk said, he's been living well. Has a house on the edge of town and a Chinese servant, quite the respectable citizen by all accounts. While the people he stole from struggle to rebuild their lives," Catherine said, her anger rekindling. "It's not right." "No, it's not," Adam agreed. "Which is why we're going to put an end to it." He pushed his plate aside, his expression turning serious. "I plan to confront him tonight at the saloon. Less chance of him slipping away in a public place and fewer opportunities for violence." "I want to be there," Catherine said firmly. Adam frowned. "The Nugget isn't a place for respectable women, Catherine." "I'm not concerned with appearances right now," she replied. "I've come all this way, Adam. I need to see his face when he realizes he's been caught." Adam studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right. But you'll stay back until I've identified myself and made it clear he's under arrest. For your own safety." Catherine agreed to his terms, and they spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for the evening's confrontation. Adam cleaned and checked his revolver, and Catherine changed into her most practical dress, a dark blue cotton that wouldn't draw attention or hinder movement if quick action became necessary. As dusk fell, they made their way to the Nugget Saloon, which occupied a prominent corner on Coloma's main street. The sound of a piano and raucous laughter spilled out into the evening air as they approached. "Remember," Adam said as they paused outside the swinging doors, "let me handle the arrest. Your job is just to confirm his identity." Catherine nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Adam must hear it. This was the moment she had been both dreading and longing for, the final confrontation with the man who had abandoned her to years of waiting. They entered the saloon together, Adam's hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the press of bodies. As Adam had predicted, Catherine's presence drew a few curious glances, but in a town like Coloma, even a respectable-looking woman in a saloon wasn't entirely unprecedented. Adam steered them toward the bar, positioning them where they could survey the room without being too obvious. "Do you see him?" he asked quietly. Catherine scanned the crowded room, the card tables, the bar, the small tables where men sat drinking and talking. For a moment she thought Thomas might not be there after all. Then her gaze landed on a figure at a corner table, his back to the wall, a glass of whiskey before him. Her breath caught. Even from across the room, there was no mistaking him. The same golden hair, now a bit longer than he had worn it in El Dorado Canyon. The same profile that had once made her heart race with affection. He was better dressed than she had ever seen him, his suit clearly expensive, a gold watch chain draped across his vest. "There," she said, her voice barely audible above the piano and chatter. "At the corner table, Alone. Adam followed her gaze, his expression hardening. That's him, all right. He turned to Catherine, his green eyes serious. Stay here at the bar. I'll approach him alone first. Catherine nodded, her throat too tight for speech. She watched as Adam made his way through the crowd, his movements casual but purposeful. He wasn't wearing his marshal's badge openly. They had agreed it would be better to confront Thomas without giving him advance warning of Adam's official capacity. As Adam approached Thomas's table, Catherine saw her former fiancé look up, his expression one of polite inquiry at first. Adam said something, gesturing to the empty chair across from Thomas. After a moment's consideration, Thomas nodded, and Adam sat down. The conversation appeared civil at first. Thomas even smiled at something Adam said, raising his glass in what seemed like a toast. Catherine strained to hear their words, but the noise of the saloon made it impossible from where she stood. Then Adam reached into his coat and produced something that Catherine knew must be his marshal's badge. She saw Thomas's expression change, instantly the color draining from his face, his body tensing as he glanced toward the saloon's exits. Adam's posture changed too, becoming more authoritative. His hand moved to rest near his holstered gun, though he didn't draw the weapon. He said something else, and Thomas's gaze darted around the room as if seeking an escape route or an ally. Then, to Catherine's shock, Thomas laughed a short, harsh sound that carried even across the noisy saloon. He leaned forward, saying something to Adam with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Adam's expression darkened in response. Catherine decided it was time to make her presence known. Taking a deep breath, she moved away from the bar and toward the corner table, weaving through the crowd with determined steps. Thomas saw her coming when she was still several paces away. His reaction was everything Catherine might have hoped for in her moments of deepest anger. His face went slack with shock, his eyes widening in disbelief, and his hand, reaching for his whiskey glass, froze in midair. "Hello, Thomas," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she had expected it to be. "Catherine," Thomas breathed as if he were seeing a ghost. "What are you doing here?" "She's helping the U.S. Marshal's service bring you to justice," Adam said calmly. "Thomas Daniels, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. I suggest you come quietly." Thomas seemed unable to take his eyes off Catherine. "You've been waiting all this time, haven't you?" he asked, something like wonder in his voice. "On that porch." The question struck Catherine like a physical blow. Even now, knowing everything she knew, Thomas still expected her loyalty. Still assumed she would wait faithfully for his return, no matter how long it took. "I did wait," she acknowledged, her voice cool. "For 2 years and 8 months. But I'm not waiting anymore, Thomas." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a calculation forming behind his eyes that Catherine recognized from the times he had talked his way out of difficult situations in El Dorado Canyon. "Catherine," he said, his voice softening into the tender tone she remembered so well. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I can explain everything." He cast a disparaging glance at Adam. "Whatever this man has told you about me, it's not the truth." "Save it, Daniels," Adam cut in. "We have your brother Matthew in custody. He's already confessed to his role in the scheme." Thomas's confidence faltered visibly. "Matthew? He wouldn't." "He did," Catherine confirmed. "He came to El Dorado Canyon looking for you, or rather, for the money you took from your victims. When he couldn't find it, he became desperate." Thomas's gaze darted between them, the last vestiges of his charming facade crumbling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "No," Catherine agreed. "You were supposed to disappear with the money, and I was supposed to spend the rest of my life waiting for you to return. Only one of those things happened, Thomas." For a moment, genuine regret seemed to flicker in Thomas's eyes. "I did care for you, Catherine. In my way." Your way wasn't enough, she said simply. Now, are you going to cooperate with Marshal Fletcher, or are you going to make this more difficult than it needs to be? Thomas looked from Catherine to Adam, assessing his options. The saloon had grown quieter, the other patrons becoming aware that something unusual was transpiring in their midst. A few nearby tables had emptied as men sensed potential trouble and moved to safer positions. I suppose I don't have much choice, Thomas said finally, his shoulders slumping in defeat. But the money is gone, Marshal, spent. There's nothing to recover. We'll see about that, Adam replied, unconvinced. Stand up slowly and keep your hands where I can see them. Thomas complied, rising from his chair with careful movements. At least allow me the dignity of walking out of here under my own power, he said. Without handcuffs. I give you my word I won't try to escape. Adam's laugh was short and without humor. Your word doesn't carry much weight, Daniels. But since we're in a public place, I'll grant you that much. Just remember that I won't hesitate to use force if you make any sudden moves. As Adam escorted Thomas toward the saloon doors, Catherine followed a few paces behind. The piano had stopped playing, and the room had grown even quieter, all eyes on the unusual procession. They had almost reached the exit when Thomas made his move. With a quickness Catherine wouldn't have expected, he shoved a bystander into Adam's path, then bolted toward the back of the saloon. Thomas, stop, Catherine called out, but he was already disappearing through a rear door. Adam recovered quickly, steadying the man who had been pushed. Stay here, he ordered Catherine, then sprinted after Thomas, weaving through the suddenly chaotic room. Catherine hesitated only briefly before following, ignoring Adam's instruction. She wasn't about to let Thomas escape, not after coming all this way, not after all the lies and wasted years. The rear door led to an alley behind the saloon. In the fading twilight, Catherine could see Thomas running toward a cross street, Adam in pursuit about 20 yards behind. Without thinking, Catherine gathered her skirts and ran after them, her practical boots making good time on the hard-packed dirt. Thomas reached the cross street and turned left, momentarily disappearing from view. Adam followed seconds later. By the time Catherine reached the intersection, both men had vanished. She paused, listening for sounds of pursuit, and heard running footsteps to her left, toward what appeared to be a residential area of town. Following the sounds, Catherine rounded another corner to find herself on a quiet street lined with modest homes. In the distance, she could see Thomas vaulting a garden fence with Adam close behind. They were heading toward a larger house set somewhat apart from its neighbors, Thomas's house, she realized. Catherine continued her pursuit, her breath coming in gasps now, but her determination undiminished. As she approached the house, she saw Adam disappear through the front door, which stood ajar. She hesitated on the porch, unsure whether to follow. From inside came the sounds of a struggle breaking furniture, male voices raised in conflict. Catherine's heart raced. Should she go for help? But the sheriff's office was back in the center of town, and by the time she returned with assistance, the confrontation would be over, one way or another. Making her decision, Catherine entered the house cautiously. The front room was in disarray, a table overturned and a lamp smashed on the floor. Following the sounds of continuing struggle, she moved deeper into the house. She found them in what appeared to be a study. Thomas had armed himself with a fireplace poker and was swinging it wildly at Adam, who was doing his best to avoid the blows while trying to draw his revolver. As Catherine appeared in the doorway, Thomas's desperate gaze fell on her. "Catherine, help me," he pleaded. "He's trying to kill me." "Put down the poker, Thomas," she said steadily. "No one wants to kill you. Marshal Fletcher is here to arrest you, nothing more." Thomas's expression twisted with desperation. "You don't understand. I can't go back to Nevada. I can't face prison." He swung the poker again, narrowly missing Adam's head. "I did it all for us, Catherine. Everything was for our future." The words, so patently false, ignited Catherine's long-suppressed anger. "There was never any us, Thomas," she said, her voice rising. "There was only you, using me as a convenient fiction, a woman waiting patiently while you committed your crimes and lived your real life far away from El Dorado Canyon." Thomas faltered, her words seeming to hit him harder than any physical blow could have. In that moment of distraction, Adam made his move. He lunged forward, grabbing Thomas's wrist and twisting it sharply. The poker clattered to the floor, and Adam used his momentum to drive Thomas against the wall, pinning him there. "Thomas Daniels, you're under arrest," Adam said, breathing hard from the exertion. "And this time, you're not going anywhere." As Adam secured Thomas's wrists with handcuffs, Catherine noticed something on the desk nearby, an open strongbox, its contents partially spilled across the polished surface. Gold coins and banknotes, hastily gathered as if Thomas had been planning to flee with them. "Adam," she said quietly, nodding toward the desk. Adam followed her gaze, his eyes widening at the sight of the money. "Well, well, it seems Mr. Daniels hasn't spent all of his ill-gotten gains after all." Thomas sagged against the wall, defeated. "It's not all of it," he muttered. "Just what I keep on hand for emergencies." "And where's the rest?" Adam demanded, tightening his grip on Thomas's arm. Thomas glanced at Catherine, then looked away. "There is no rest," he said flatly. "I spent it. On this house, on clothes, on living the life I deserved." "You mean the life you stole," Catherine corrected him, moving to the desk to examine the contents of the strongbox. "How much is here?" "A few $100s. Maybe 1,000, Thomas replied sullenly. "Like I said, emergency funds." Adam smiled grimly. "Well, it's a start. And I'm betting a thorough search of this house and your bank accounts will turn up more." He looked at Catherine. "Would you mind gathering that money while I secure our prisoner? There should be a cloth bag or something we can use." As Adam led Thomas from the room, Catherine carefully collected the scattered money, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. Relief that Thomas was finally apprehended. Satisfaction that at least some of the stolen money would be returned to its rightful owners. And underneath it all, a profound sadness for the years she had wasted loving and waiting for a man who had never deserved either. By the time Adam returned, Catherine had gathered all the money into a leather pouch she had found in the desk drawer. "I counted it," she said. "Just over $900. Adam nodded, taking the pouch and securing it inside his coat. "I've sent Thomas's housekeeper to fetch the town marshal. He'll help us transport Daniels back to the jail for the night. Tomorrow we'll start the process of returning him to Nevada." Catherine nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the tension of the chase and capture had subsided. "What happens now? To the money, I mean." "It will be cataloged as evidence and eventually returned to the victims, as much as can be recovered." Adam's expression softened as he looked at her. "Are you all right? That was quite a chase you gave us." "I'm fine," Catherine assured him, though in truth she felt shaky and drained. I need a moment." Adam nodded in understanding. "Take all the time you need, I'll be just outside." After he left, Catherine sank into the desk chair, looking around the room that represented the life Thomas had built for himself while she waited faithfully in El Dorado Canyon. The furnishings were expensive, the artwork on the walls clearly chosen with care. This was where the real Thomas had lived, not the prospector who had courted her with tales of future wealth, but the confidence man who had used those tales to mask his true nature. On the desk, partially covered by papers that had been disturbed in the struggle, was a framed photograph. Catherine pulled it closer and felt her breath catch. It showed Thomas standing proudly in front of this very house, his arm around the waist of a smiling young woman Catherine had never seen before. The betrayal, which Catherine had thought she had already fully comprehended, cut deeper still. Not only had Thomas abandoned her, but he had replaced her, creating a new life with someone else while she kept her faithful vigil. Catherine set the photograph down carefully, wiped away the tears that had formed without her realizing it, and stood up. Whatever hold Thomas Daniels had once had on her heart was gone now, dissolved in the harsh light of truth. When she walked out of the study, she left behind not just the room but the last vestiges of the woman she had been, the woman who waited on the porch for a man who never came. Outside, Adam was conversing with an older man who must be the town marshal. Thomas sat on the front steps, handcuffed and dejected, guarded by a deputy. As Catherine emerged from the house, Adam turned to her with concern. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. Catherine looked at Thomas, who refused to meet her gaze, then back to Adam. His green eyes held genuine care and respect, a stark contrast to the manipulation she now recognized in every interaction with Thomas. "Yes," she said, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "For the first time in a very long time, everything is exactly as it should be." The journey back to Nevada was considerably less eventful than the trip to California had been. Thomas, resigned to his fate, made no further attempts to escape. He spoke little, responding to direct questions from Adam but otherwise maintaining a sullen silence. He avoided Catherine's gaze whenever possible, as if unable to face the woman he had so thoroughly deceived. For her part, Catherine was content to let him brood. Her anger had burned itself out during their confrontation in Coloma, leaving behind a clear-eyed understanding of who Thomas truly was, and by extension, who she herself had become during her years of waiting. Adam, ever attentive to her comfort, made sure Catherine had as much privacy as the journey allowed. In the evenings, when they stopped at way stations or small hotels, he would sit with her on porches or in quiet corners of dining rooms, talking of inconsequential things to take her mind off their prisoner and the uncomfortable circumstances. On their final night before reaching Carson City, as they sat on the porch of a roadside inn watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight, Adam broached the subject that had remained unspoken between them. "What will you do when we return to El Dorado Canyon?" he asked, his voice gentle in the gathering darkness. Catherine had been asking herself the same question. The woman who had left El Dorado Canyon, the woman who waited, no longer existed. But who would she become in her place? "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "Continue with my sewing, I suppose, tend my garden." She paused, considering, but differently this time. Not as ways to pass the time until something better comes along, but as a life in itself, a life I choose. Adam nodded, his profile thoughtful in the dim light. "It's a good life," he agreed. "Honest work, a home of your own, many would envy that." "Yes," Catherine turned to look at him directly. "But what about you, Adam? After Thomas stands trial and this case is closed, what then?" He smiled slightly. "Back to my duties. There are always more fugitives to track, more cases to solve." The smile faded. "Though I admit this one has been different, because you were personally affected," Catherine suggested, "as one of the victims." "That's part of it," Adam acknowledged. He hesitated, then added more softly, "but mostly because of you, Catherine." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Catherine felt her heart quicken. "I've never met anyone quite like you," Adam continued when she remained silent. "Your strength, your dignity even in the face of such betrayal. The way you've confronted the truth about Thomas without flinching, even when it must have been painful to hear." "I've had enough of lies," Catherine said, "even comforting ones I might tell myself." "Yes." Adam's voice was warm with approval. "That's exactly what I mean." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of the night enveloping them crickets, the occasional distant coyote, the soft murmur of voices from inside the inn. "I'll be returning to El Dorado Canyon with you," Adam said finally, "to give my testimony at Thomas's trial. I expect I'll be there for at least a few weeks, possibly longer if there are complications." "I see," Catherine said, unsure why this information made her heart beat faster. "I was thinking," Adam continued, his voice casual but with an undercurrent of tension, "that I might need a place to stay during that time. The boarding house is comfortable enough, but, Catherine prompted when he trailed off. Adam turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in the faint light spilling from the inn's windows. "But I find myself reluctant to be too far from a certain porch, and the remarkable woman who no longer waits upon it." Catherine caught her breath, understanding his meaning. "Adam, I'm not Thomas," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments, just time. Time to see if what I've begun to feel for you might be something you could one day return." The sincerity in his voice moved Catherine deeply. Here was no smooth-talking confidence man selling dreams of easy riches, but a man offering honest work and genuine feeling, a man who had proven his integrity through action rather than words. "The house does have a spare room," Catherine said slowly. "Currently used for storage, but it could be cleared out. It would be more economical than the boarding house, certainly." Adam's smile was like the dawn breaking. "Economical. Yes, that's a consideration." Catherine felt an answering smile tug at her lips, the expression still unfamiliar after so long. "And I do believe Mrs. Powell and the rest of the town would find less to gossip about if you were staying in my home as a proper boarder rather than calling on me every day." "Very practical," Adam agreed, his green eyes alight with something that belied the prosaic nature of their conversation. "I've always admired practical women." "Have you?" Catherine's voice had softened to match his, the teasing tone a revelation to her own ears. "Immensely." Adam reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand in his. "Especially those who are also brave and true and remarkably beautiful in the starlight." Catherine felt a blush warm her cheeks, but she didn't pull her hand away. "You should know, Adam, that I'm not looking for another man to wait for. If this becomes something more, it would have to be a partnership, equal and honest." "I would expect nothing less," he assured her, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "In fact, I'd insist upon it." They sat there hand in hand as the stars wheeled overhead, the future stretching before them like an unwritten page, blank, perhaps, but full of possibility. 6 months later, on a golden autumn afternoon, Catherine stood on her porch watching the familiar dust devils dance down El Dorado Canyon's Main Street. She wore a new dress, deep green to match her eyes, and her honey blonde hair was arranged in a style that softened her face, making her look younger than she had in years. The trial of Thomas and Matthew Daniels had concluded 2 months earlier, with both brothers receiving substantial prison sentences. Nearly half of the stolen money had been recovered and returned to the victims, including $500 to Adam Fletcher money he had promptly invested in improvements to Catherine's small house. The spare room now served as Adam's office, where he reviewed cases and wrote reports during the periods when he was not traveling for his martial duties. A new barn had been constructed behind the house, home to Adam's horse, and a milk cow Catherine had always wanted but never felt justified in purchasing while she lived alone. Most significantly, the porch where Catherine had spent so many hours waiting had been expanded to wrap around 2 sides of the house, with comfortable chairs placed to catch both morning and evening light. It was no longer a lookout point for a man who would never return, but a pleasant place for a couple to sit together at the end of a day's work. As Catherine surveyed these changes, she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart quickened, as it always did when Adam returned from his periodic trips to Carson City or other towns where his duties took him. He appeared around the bend in the road, riding tall and easy in the saddle, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. When he saw Catherine on the porch, his face broke into a wide smile that never failed to warm her from within. "Right on time," she called as he approached the gate. "Supper's nearly ready." Adam dismounted, securing his horse to the hitching post before striding up the path to the porch. Unlike Thomas, who had always lingered at the gate with promises to return soon, Adam came directly to her, closing the distance between them as if drawn by an invisible force. "I missed you," he said simply, taking her hands in his. "You were only gone 3 days," Catherine replied, though in truth she had missed him too, not with the desperate longing of her waiting years, but with a steady, healthy desire for the companionship they had built together. 3 days too long. Adam raised one hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "But I bring good news from Carson City." "Oh," Catherine raised an eyebrow, curious. "The judge approved my request for a month's leave, starting next week." Adam's green eyes held hers, gauging her reaction. "Plenty of time for a honeymoon, if a certain lady is still amenable to becoming Mrs. Fletcher." Catherine felt her smile bloom fully, matching his own. Their engagement had been a brief one by most standards, just 2 months, but after nearly 3 years of waiting for a man who never intended to return, Catherine had no desire to delay happiness when it was finally within her grasp. "The lady is very amenable," she assured him, stepping closer. "In fact, she's been counting the days." Adam wrapped his arms around her waist, drawing her against him. "No more waiting on porches, Catherine," he murmured. "From now on, we walk forward together." "I like the sound of that," Catherine whispered, tilting her face up to his. As Adam's lips met hers in a kiss full of promise, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that her waiting days were done forever. The woman who had stood faithfully on this porch for nearly 3 years, scanning the horizon for a man who never came, had finally found what she truly deserved, not in patient endurance, but in the courage to step off the porch and into a future of her own making. And beside her, every step of the way, would be the man who had kept his word. "I'll be the one who does." 5 years later, the porch of the Fletcher home was no longer a place of waiting but a place of joyful reunion. Catherine sat in one of the comfortable rocking chairs, a small quilt draped over her lap despite the warmth of the spring day. Beside her, 3-year-old Thomas, named not for the man who had deceived her, but for Adam's beloved grandfather, played with wooden blocks, building towers only to knock them down with delighted giggles. In her arms, Catherine cradled her newest blessing, 1-month-old Elizabeth, sleeping peacefully against her mother's breast, tiny fingers curled around a lock of Catherine's hair. The sound of a wagon approaching drew Catherine's attention to the road. Adam was returning from town with supplies and, more importantly, their oldest child, 5-year-old James, who had accompanied his father on what he solemnly referred to as martial business. As the wagon pulled up to the gate, James was already scrambling to jump down, eager to share his adventures with his mother and brother. "Careful, son," Adam cautioned, though his voice held more pride than concern. At 5, James was already showing the same steady confidence that characterized his father. "Mama," James called, racing up the path. "Papa let me help deliver papers to Judge Wilson, and we saw a real outlaw." Catherine raised an eyebrow at Adam, who was following at a more measured pace, his arms full of parcels. "An outlaw?" she asked, her tone making it clear that an explanation was expected. "A very reformed outlaw," Adam clarified with a grin. "Old Jake Winters, who served his time and now sweeps the bank steps. But to James, anyone who ever wore handcuffs qualifies as an outlaw." James was undeterred by this clarification. He had a scar, Mama, right here. He drew his finger across his cheek dramatically. Papa says it was from a knife fight, which happened 20 years ago, Adam added hastily at Catherine's pointed look, and which Jake deeply regrets, as he told James at some length. Catherine shook her head, smiling despite herself. Well, I'm glad you both had an educational outing. Now, James, why don't you show your brother the new toy Papa promised to bring home? James's eyes widened in remembered excitement. The horse. Papa, where is it? Adam set down his packages and reached into his coat pocket, producing a small, intricately carved wooden horse. Handmade by Mr. Chen, he said as James took it reverently. He says to tell you it's a special horse that only goes on adventures with brave, obedient boys. I'm brave and obedient, James declared, already kneeling to show the treasure to his younger brother. Look, Tommy. It's just like Papa's horse, but smaller. As the boys became absorbed in play, Adam climbed the porch steps and bent to kiss Catherine's forehead, then the downy head of his sleeping daughter. How are my best girls? He asked softly. Perfectly well, Catherine assured him. Elizabeth has been sleeping like an angel, and I managed to finish mending your shirts while she napped. Adam sat in the rocker beside her, his gaze taking in the domestic scene with evident satisfaction. I ran into Mrs. Powell at the general store, he said. She mentioned that the Ladies' Aid Society is organizing a special collection for the new schoolhouse. Thought you might be interested once you're up and about again. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. Since settling in El Dorado Canyon permanently, Adam had always supported her involvement in community affairs. Unlike Thomas, who had preferred to keep Catherine somewhat isolated, Adam took pride in his wife's contributions to the town they both now called home. I'd like that, she said. Miss Jenkins was saying just last week that they are in desperate need of new readers for the older children. Then we'll make sure they get them, Adam said simply, as if the matter were already settled, which in many ways it was. In the Fletcher household, decisions were made together, with each partner's wishes given equal weight. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching their sons play and listening to the soft, snuffling breaths of their daughter. The shadows lengthened across the porch as the afternoon began its gentle slide toward evening, painting the canyon in hues of gold and amber. You ever think about him? Adam asked suddenly, his voice quiet enough that the boys couldn't hear. Catherine didn't need to ask who he meant. Sometimes, she admitted. Not with regret or longing, but with a kind of gratitude, I suppose. Adam raised an eyebrow, surprised. Gratitude for Thomas Daniels. Not for him exactly, Catherine clarified, but for the path that led from him to you, to this. She glanced down at Elizabeth, then at the boys, then back to her husband. If I hadn't spent those years waiting on this porch, I might never have been here when you arrived. We might never have found each other. Adam reached across the space between their rockers, taking her free hand in his. I'd like to think we would have, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Some things are meant to be, Catherine. Some people are meant to find each other, no matter what roads they travel to get there. Catherine squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the gentle strength that had never failed to support her. Well, I'm grateful anyway, for every step of the journey that brought us here. Adam lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it softly. As am I, my love, as am I. As the sun began to set over El Dorado Canyon, casting long shadows across the land, the Fletcher family remained on their porch, not waiting, but simply being together. The woman who had once stood vigil for a man who never returned had found something far more precious. A man who always came home, and a life built on trust rather than empty promises. The porch was no longer a place of solitary waiting, but a gathering spot for a family bound by love and truth. And as Catherine looked at the faces of her husband and children, she knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had led her here to this porch, this moment, this life that was more fulfilling than any she had ever dreamed of during those long years of waiting. For on this porch, the waiting had ended, and the real living had finally begun.